Good evening. This is Gary. Today, I want to be speaking to you between this week and the next week. It's about sinning against God. Now, and what it says here is, sinning is eventually against Him because His law reflects His holy nature, and breaking it is a private offense against the Lord. If you have your Bible or your Bible app, please mark these following scriptures down. For instance, go to 1 John 3 4, read 1 John 3 4, and then read Romans 3:23. Now, and especially when sin harms each other or puts each other in danger, they are first and foremost violations of God's commands, as seen in David's confession, Psalm 51:4, and Joseph's refusal to sin, taken from Genesis 39:9. Now, since the Lord is the ultimate authority, that means the omnipresent, almighty, and the great authority, and not to mention the patriarch of all lords, the father of lords. You have to understand that sin is a breach of faith against him, and he himself is the rightful judge. Leviticus 8:6-2, Acts 17:30-31. Now, I'm going to ask you to mark these scriptures down, so when the message is over, I want you to read them. Again, that's Leviticus 6:2 and Acts 17:30-31. Now, just as crimes are prosecuted by the state rather than the victim alone, sin is judged only by God, who has appointed Christ as the final judge. Read Ezekiel 18:4 and John 5:22. But through Jesus' sacrifice, all sin can be forgiven, offering believers salvation and escape from God's righteous judgment. Ephesians 2, verses 8-10. Now, oops, I don't mean to go through that. There, that's better. Now, taken from the Old Testament, here's what I have learned so far. Since God's law is a reflection of his holy nature, in order to sin by transgressing his law is the same as offending him on the more private nature in the more rude, disgusting way. This point is illustrated for ourselves in narrators concerning David's sin of adultery and murder, as well as the temptation of Joseph by Potiphar's wife. Psalms 51:4, Genesis 39:9. Even though adultery and murder are clearly sins against other people, both David and Joseph viewed them to be primarily against God himself. Another thing I've learned was sin against a neighbor is described as a breach of faith against the Lord. Leviticus 6:2. Since God is the ultimate authority, and what I've learned was, since God is the ultimate authority over all people, sin is an offense against him. Ezekiel 18:4. But from the New Testament, here's what I've also learned. God is the rightful prosecutor and judge. Acts 17:30-31. Next, followed by sin is a transgression of his law. That's God's law, all right? 1 John 3:4, Romans 4:15. Next, there are three more things right on my smartphone there, and among them is sin by their very definition is against God, because in order to sin means you either violate God's prohibited commands or to or to forbid yourself in practicing his positive commands. James 4:17. Next, the next one I have already covered up was sin is defined in relations to God's glory, indicating that each and every sin is an offense against him. Romans 3:23. And finally, the last one that I have covered up was just as every sin is eventually against God, every sin can be eventually forgiven because of God's gift of Jesus Christ. That was what I have told you about in the series of messages there. And you also need to read scriptures such as Matthew 26:28, John 4:10, and finally Ephesians 2 verses 8 through 10. Now, here are the implications for today. And this is the last part. We sin against each other for doing to them what God has forbidden, or by failing to do to each other or for each other of what God has commanded us to do. Read Matthew 22:39 and James 2:8. However, the commandments, though, do not come from each other with the exception of God himself. Chances are the sin is first and foremost against him. And an analogy can be seen in criminal law. When a person, in other words, when a person commits a crime against another person, he or she has not only violated that person, but the law of a state or country primarily, bottom line. This is the reason why it is the government, not the individual itself, who has been harmed, who himself is named in the legal caption. For example, the state of Florida versus Mr. Jones. The government prosecutes and executes judgment. Likewise, when we sin against each other, we are transgressing not their law, but of God's law. Chances are God is the rightful prosecutor and judge. Read Acts 17 through 30 through 31. Now, God has appointed his son, Jesus Christ, to carry out his judgment. John 5:22. But by believing in Jesus Christ's sacrificial death and glorious resurrection, we are saved. In other words, we escape God's just wrath against sin for believing that God has washed us clean of each and every sin we have, and we will commit against him based on the substantiary atoning death of his son. All right? Here are a few things I want you to understand. The first thing I want you to understand is, since the law reflects God's holy nature, any violation of that is a private offense against him, all right? And private against him, nobody else. The next thing I want you to understand is sin is judged by God, the rightful judge. And the third thing you have to understand is every sin can be forgiven through Christ by restoring our relationship with God. Here are three things I want you to reflect. Number one, how does recognizing that all sin is ultimately against God change the way you view your actions and motivations? Number two, how have you, next question I want you to answer yourself is, how have you experienced God's forgiveness for sins you've committed against him, and how has that shaped your relationship with him? And the third question you have to answer yourself is, how can you remind yourself that sin is not just a breach against others, but the violation against God? And how does this understanding impact your behavior? Mm-hmm. Three things I want you to engage. This is the last one. Number one, how can we help others understand that sin is eventually against God, not just the wrongdoing against everybody else or everywhere else? Next, what is significance in understanding that every sin is eventually against God? And how does that impact the way we respond to our sin? And finally, how does the biblically analogy of criminal law, where the state prosecutes a crime, help us better understand why God is why God is the rightful prosecutor and judge of sin? Think about all this, all right? You think about all this. Now, when I come back next week, I'm going to then be talking to you about why is every sin eventually a sin against God. All right. That one I got was from Compelling Truth, but this one here is from God's Questions. I will be talking to you about sin being eventually against God. And you know what? This is very, very, very important for us to understand um, why we try to learn all good from evil. All right. So you take good care of yourself and each other. Thank you very much, and goodbye.